Our lecture today is on the wonderful J.R.R. Tolkien. What do you know him for most?
The Lord of the Rings.
Everybody, Lord of the Rings, right? Lord of the Rings. And we just finished studying Beowulf, and that's why I'm going to talk to you about Tolkien today. He's not a medieval author, and we're studying the Middle Ages right now, so what's the deal? However, Tolkien did write in the medieval style, and his greatest inspiration for Lord of the Rings was Beowulf. As we were reading Beowulf, I kept asking you, did you notice the Lord of the Rings feel in certain parts, like the slaying of the dragon? And how many of you could see why that was an inspiration for Lord of the Rings? You could sort of feel the similarities. Let me tell you a little bit about Tolkien. First of all, I want you to look at this list I put on the board. He was born in 1892, just before the turn of the century, and died in 73. He was an author, philologist, husband and father, soldier in World War I, codebreaker in World War II, artist and illustrator, lexicographer and etymologist. This has to do with etymology is learning how words developed in the language, and lexicographer is organizing them. So this is when he would work for helping with the dictionary. And a university professor, and that was at Oxford University. So he had a lot of things that he did in his lifetime. Oh, I thought you might not know, philologist is also the study of how words developed, a little different than here, but that language was his love and his specialty. So he was born in South Africa, and his J.R.R. Tolkien, he always went by that, but it stands for John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. Born in 82, and his mother's name was Mabel. His father's name was Arthur, like King Arthur. And he had one sibling. He had a younger brother named Hilary. And I'll show you a picture of both of them when they were kids in a little bit. But I want to talk about just a couple significant things that happened to Tolkien in his childhood that experts think has a direct effect on the Lord of the Rings. One of them was when he was a little child, he was bitten by a baboon spider. Now, baboon spiders are deadly, especially for a little child. He was bitten, and he went into somewhat of a haze during this time. They didn't know if he was going to live or not. And the family doctor, Dr. Thornton Quimby, stayed at his side until he finally pulled through it. He was there every time he would open his eyes, he would see that Dr. Quimby was there. And a lot of experts feel that Quimby was a model for Gandalf the Grey. And you remember in Lord of the Rings, when he's unconscious and he's in the bed, and Gandalf is sitting there beside him when he comes to, and he says, "What day is it?" And Gandalf says, "October 24th, to be exact." He has his pipe there, and that they think was modeled after Dr. Quimby. Another incident that happened to him as a young child, and as a parent, this one just horrifies me. There was a young servant in their home in South Africa, and this young servant was in a village that had a kraal, and a kraal, K-R-A-A-L, I'm going to show you a picture of it, it's kind of hard to see from there. A kraal is a center part of a village that's built up by mud walls or fences, and it's where they keep cattle or animals, and then they have their huts around the outside. Well, this very young servant thought that Tolkien was such a beautiful, cute baby, she wanted to show them to her family and her friends. So this girl takes him without saying anything to anybody to her kraal to show him off, and doesn't come back till the next day. Can you imagine what his parents must have been going through? When I read that, I went, oh, that's like heart attack time for parents. So that was a little frightening for the parents, but he was probably fine. When he was 3 years old, however, and it was before 3 that he'd been bitten by the spider and that he had been taken away to the kraal and his parents were looking for him. But when he was 3, he went with his mother on a trip to England because that was his home country. That's where his parents were from. And while they were in England, his beloved father, died of rheumatic fever. The sad part is they didn't have life insurance back then, and when the father died, they were left without an income. And this was really hard on Tolkien's mother and the 2 boys. So the best choice she could make at that point was to take her two boys and go live with her own parents in England. So they moved to be with the family, and this was in 1896. They moved to Sarehole, and he was 4. So he enjoyed, while he was there, exploring the mill and Moseley Bog. There was a bog there that he could explore. What's a bog? Does anyone know? It's kind of like a swampy area, and I just put them away, or I could show you in world history. I was showing them bog mummies, because if you fall in a bog and sink, there are chemicals in there that preserve the body amazingly well. I should really, maybe Mrs. Barnes can find it. It's in, it's under mummies under World History Chapter 1. And maybe she can show you a picture of a bog mummy. So he explored around the bog. Obviously, he didn't fall in because he lived to write wonderful works. But he would explore there in the hills. He loved nature. And one of his favorite places was his aunt's farm called Bag Inn. Bag Inn. Does that sound familiar? So we can see these little influences in his life affecting his writing. And all authors are affected in their writing by what they live. That's what we write about. It's our lives and the things we've experienced. So Mabel homeschooled the two boys, Hillary and Ronald, and she taught them her best subject, which was botany. She loved botany, and he learned all about plants. Do you remember in Lord of the Rings when he sends someone to look for a certain plant to help slow the poison when Frodo is stabbed? That's a real plant. He knew about plants. He could include that information in his repertoire of writing because his mother taught him so much. And he loved to draw. He drew landscapes, and his favorite lessons when he was being schooled had to do with language. He loved languages. He learned Latin before he was 11. He just loved language. He could read by the age of 4, and he greatly disliked Alice in Wonderland because it was so weird, and the Pied Piper because, you know, that's a story about a man who tricks all these kids so he can harm them. And he thought they were creepy, but the kinds of things Tolkien liked, and this fits in very well too, were fantasy works by George MacDowell, and also Andrew Lang wrote fairy stories, and he loved those. So you can see the magical and fantasy element appealed to him even as a very young child. But then something happened that really changed Tolkien's life in a big, big way. His mother, Mabel, was converted to Catholicism, and she was very sincere about her Catholic faith. Her parents, however, were Baptist, and when she converted to Catholicism, they totally cut her off. She couldn't live with them. They wouldn't give her any financial help at all, and this put her back in a position of great need. And it's sad when you read about that kind of intolerance between parents and children. You know, my children are going to make choices that are different than mine in many ways, but I don't plan to disown them for it. But that's what these parents did. And so he was probably he was 9 because it was 1900. Yeah, he was about 9 when she converted to Catholicism, and they went through some real meager times. Now Mabel, his mother, who he loved very much, suffered from diabetes. And because of their financial situation, she couldn't get the treatments that she needed. She couldn't get the right foods. And so when he was 12 years old, his mother died from acute diabetes. She was only 34. And this is the way he looked at it. I'm going to read you a quote from Tolkien about his mother's death that I think is really interesting. "My own dear mother was a martyr indeed, and it is not to everybody that God grants so easy a way to his great gifts as he did to Hillary and myself, giving us a mother who killed herself with labor and trouble to ensure us keeping the faith." Tolkien would never leave Catholicism. He considered his mother a martyr of the Catholic Church, and there are lots of good things about the Catholic Church. There are lots of things that are noteworthy and fine, even though the oldest church in history is the Catholic Church, and they've had plenty of time to also experience corruption. But she was dedicated to this church. And prior to her death, when she got suspicious that she might be going, she did a will, and she assigned the guardianship of her sons, not to her parents, but to her very close friend, He was a friar, Francis Xavier Morgan, so you can just say the priest Morgan was his last name. And she wanted him to bring her sons up as good Catholics. And Tolkien remembers and can tell you detailed writings about Father Morgan and what Father Morgan did for him. Father Morgan is the first place that he said he learned charity and forgiveness, and yet he said in other ways he wasn't a perfect man either, but he appreciated what Father Morgan had done for them. I'm going to just take a minute here and show you a bog mummy. Isn't this fascinating? This mummy, this is a man, if you can see the picture closely, some of you have copies of it. He has a rope around his neck, and he is several hundred years old, but he looks almost like a sculptor because he was so preserved in the bog. And if you want to read about it, it's another class, but it'll tell you what chemicals and conditions make that happen. I was just teaching the world history class that there are other kinds of mummies besides the ones the Egyptians wrapped up. There's bog mummies, and there's the mummies of China that were floating in liquid, and there's mummies that were preserved in ice. So this is the bog mummies. I just thought it would be interesting since Tolkien explored the bog areas, but he must have been smart enough to be careful. All right, so Tolkien's mother dies. She leaves him to Dr. or Father Morgan, and he was such a devout Catholic. Now, some of you already know that Tolkien is the person who was influential in the conversion of C.S. Lewis. He's the one that, as you say in the Christian circle, brought C.S. Lewis to faith, or brought him to Christ. His only great disappointment was that C.S. Lewis decided to be an Anglican and joined the Anglican Church instead of being a Roman Catholic, and that was a disappointment to him, but they were good friends. After his mother's death, Tolkien, King Edward's School, Birmingham, where he later won a scholarship. He was only 11 years old, and he won a scholarship to King Edward's, and that's where he went to school. He was a cadet while he was there. They were training the boys as cadets, and he actually was one of the cadets that was lining the street when King George V was crowned. He was right outside the gates of Buckingham Palace. If you've been to Buckingham, there's those beautiful gates they open where all the important people come in. He was standing right next to the gate, keeping the crowds back during this crowning of King George V. And he lived, when he was living at King Edward's, he had some buildings around him that were kind of medieval looking. There were several buildings. One had a Victorian tower, and some experts say this may have influenced his idea of the Dark Tower because he was surrounded by this kind of architecture there. So in his teens, let's talk about his teens. When he became a teenager, he was still passionate about languages, and he had two cousins, Mary and Marjorie, and they loved making up languages. And they invented together an imaginary language. They called it Napharin, and they learned to speak it very fluently so they could communicate with each other, and no one else would have a clue what they were talking about. That must have been fun. That'd be fun for if you had a little club or group of kids where you had your own private language. And after that, he tended to construct languages. He thought that was really fun. Is your hand up?
Yeah, I was wondering what her name was.
His mother?
Oh, what did it with her?
No, he didn't. He did it with his two cousins,
Oh.
Mary and Marjorie.
What was it called again?
They called their language Napharin, N-A-F-F-A-R-I-N. Now, you know the languages that Tolkien invented for Lord of the Rings are real languages. The Elfin language can be learned and spoken. It's a beautiful language. I have a book on it, and when a student named Otanelli Yanku was here, some of you may know her still, we started working a little bit on, we wanted to learn to speak Elvish. Also, the languages of the other characters, I think the ringmasters, the wraiths, had language. So he made up languages for that movie. In 9/11, while he was still at King Edward's School in Birmingham, he had some very, very close friends. I'm not going to tell you their full names. They were Rob, Jeffrey, Christopher, three especially, and the four of them formed a secret society that they called the TCBS. The TCBS. And this stood for Tea Club and Barovian society, alluded to their fondness for drinking tea in Barrow's store. So they called it Barovian. So it was the Tea Club and Barovian Society. And they would meet secretly in the school library when they weren't supposed to be there. And this meeting was strongly dedicated to the whole idea of writing and poetry and the literary arts. In 1911, when Tolkien, he must have been around 18 or 19, he got to take a summer holiday trip to Switzerland. And he, in his writings, recalls vividly the icy mountains, how overwhelming and powerful and beautiful they were. And of course, he used that snowy mountain scene in Bilbo's journey across the misty mountains, and it's very much like what it would have been for him in Switzerland. Also that same year, 1911, he began studying at Exeter College in Oxford. And really, once he got to Oxford in 1911, in my opinion, that was Oxford was the center of his existence for the rest of his life. The end of his life, he was a professor there, but this is his first time to Oxford, and he went to Exeter College. He had signed up to learn the classics, but he changed his major, and he wanted to do English language and literature. He started English language and literature when he was about 21. And when he graduated, he got first-class honors in his final examination. So let's face it, when you do outstandingly at a field, it's because you love it. And he loved language and words, and I can really relate to that. Now we're going to back up a couple years and tell you how he met his wife, because this is a really fascinating story. His wife was named Edith Bratt. Her maiden name is Bratt. That doesn't sound very inviting. B-R-A-T-T. Edith Mary Bratt. But he met her when he was 16 years old. And they just had so much fun together. She was a little older than him, but they definitely fell in love. And here's a quote from one of the books on Tolkien. It says, Edith and Ronald took to frequenting Birmingham's tea shops, especially one that had a balcony overlooking the pavement. There they would sit and throw sugar lumps into the hats of passers-by, moving to the next table when the sugar bowl was empty. With two people of their personalities and in their position, romance was bound to flourish. Both were orphans in need of affection, and they found that they could give it to each other. During the summer of 1909, they decided that they were in love. So he meets this young woman at age 16. Now they're supposed to write to each other, but Father Morgan disapproves, and he tells Tolkien, he doesn't even give Tolkien a chance to write a letter to Edith and tell her what happened. He cuts off the communication, and he tells Tolkien, I don't want you communicating with this girl until you are 21 years old. Now he's 16. What would you do?
Sneak around.
I'd sneak around. Tolkien obeyed. It was painful for him not to be able to tell Edith what happened, and it was painful for Edith not knowing what happened. But he was faithful to what he was told to do. From age 16 to 21, he did not communicate with Edith in any way. So you have to admire his honor in that, because that must have been incredibly difficult. The day of his 21st birthday, what do you think the first thing he did was? He went to find Edith. He wrote to her, he declared his love, told him what happened, and then found out that she had already agreed to marry another man. She felt like he'd just given up.